I'm back on my balcony for my cold open, although I have a long lens this time so that I can focus first of all just on this shrine. There's a Buddhist house shrine protecting the house from ghosts. And it leads me into today's topic, which I'm going to extend probably for several weeks. I'm going to start with the idea of faith. What is faith and who has it and who is dependent on it? Let me just move a little to show you that we have lots of religious symbols on my street, all symbolizing some kind of faith. And this is what I'm going to be talking about for the next week or two. What is faith and who has it? And the point I'm going to make is that every human endeavor, that's right, every human endeavor, including the most rock-solid science and mathematics, rests on faith. So let's get into it. So here I am again in my local monastery, and I'm choosing to start here because I want to talk about what I consider to be the non-debate between religion and science. Now, a lot of people argue that religion is the opposite of science, or that somehow they are in conflict. And that's a long debate going back into the 19th century, and I'm going to question that notion. So I'm starting here in the monastery because I want to talk a little bit about religion and about what religion is and why some people don't want to believe in religion and want to choose science over religion. Now, this is where faith comes in. A lot of people want to argue that religion is all about faith or belief, and that science is about knowledge. Now, that dichotomy is the one that I want to question. In particular, I want to argue that both rely on faith. Maybe a different kind of faith, but it's still faith. And in fact, faith governs our lives every day. The problem that many people have with religion, and they put it in capital letters, religion, is usually a problem that they have with the religions that they know. They were brought up maybe Jewish, maybe Catholic. I was brought up Presbyterian. And of course, when I rejected religion in my 20s, I was actually rejecting Presbyterianism. I picked it back up again later, but when I rejected it, it was because it was the religion I knew. Well, here we're in a Buddhist temple. When people reject religion, to what extent are they rejecting Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism or any number of other religions, shamanism, animism? I don't think they're rejecting it all because they don't know it all. And here is where one of my problems begins. We have notable celebrity atheists such as Richard Dawkins saying all religion is stupid. But then he points to religious beliefs that a few people have, especially in connection with evolution. And he's an evolutionary biologist, and he looks at their beliefs about evolution, particularly evangelical fundamentalist ideas about evolution, and he says it's all nonsense. Well, I would agree with him that certain religious beliefs are nonsense, but I'm not going to reject all religion because of my disagreement with some parts of some religion. That's being overgeneral, and I don't want to do that. Now, in the 19th century, anthropologists divided worldviews into three types: magic, religion, and science. And they believed that the three worldviews were based on three different principles of faith. Magic believed that everything in the world was connected to everything else, so action on any one part of the world or the universe affected every other part, and if you knew the rules of how the parts interacted, then you could affect changes. And then religion, which was the next stage, believed that the supernatural world, particularly the world inhabited by God and angels and other supernatural beings, was separate from the world, and that you had to petition the supernatural world in form of prayers or something like that, and that sometimes the answer to your petition was yes, and sometimes the answer was no. Whereas in magic, if you knew the right formula, you could always make changes in the world. And then science is supposedly the most sophisticated, where again, like magic, you need to know the rules that govern the world, and you can affect changes, but you can't always affect changes at a distance using science, or at least the science of the 19th century and the 20th century, and that some things are impossible according to science. And this was considered to be a general evolutionary principle, that as human culture developed, it moved through the stages of magic, religion, and science. Well, the first thing I want to say is that in every culture, magic and religion and science stand side by side in different proportions, depending on the culture and depending on the time and also depending on the people. But we all have all of those views somehow or other. Modern superstitions, for example, are the equivalent of magic. And we all have some form of superstition. So for me, the question is not whether you believe in religion or science, but rather what is the proportion of your belief in religion and your belief in science. And I also want to ask the question, why do you believe science over religion sometimes? Now, there's also a problem that some people believe that religion is a substitute for science, that people use religion when science fails them. Sometimes it's called the God of the gaps. Like when we don't know something, then we appeal to God. Well, I don't believe that either. I believe that religion has a very different function from science, and that the two can work in conjunction with one another. Not only that, sometimes I think that they come together. In fact, the modern interpretation of consciousness in science and particle physics is beginning to get somewhat adjacent to Buddhist beliefs. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to go back to my apartment shortly and we'll have a more thorough investigation of these ideas. I'm just putting the starting points out there right now. I'm beginning to challenge directly the idea that religion and science are opposite. I think they are just different ways of viewing the world, and that they can be complementary, or, in my more radical sense, they're not different at all. Okay, I'm going to have to unpack that, and to do that I'm going to go back to my apartment where I can get out some bells and whistles and you'll see my talking head. Alright, so it's talking head time again. Not these talking heads, but this one. So, I'm going to introduce you first to three 19th century anthropologists and their work, because they are all germane to the general evolutionary theory of magic to religion to science. They are Edward Burnett Tylor, sometimes just called E.B. Tylor, who is a British social anthropologist. Lewis Henry Morgan, who worked in the United States, mostly with the Iroquois in upstate New York. And James George Frazer, whose famous work, The Golden Bough, was hugely influential throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, and is in fact still very popular among people who know little or nothing about anthropology. He keeps recurring in people's thoughts because they like to believe in general evolution. So let's talk about general evolution a little. Both Morgan and Tylor believed that culture went through phases, and I'm going to simplify the terminology. They're both close to each other, but a little bit different. That is, they both believed that societies inevitably evolved through phases that could be documented and even predicted. And they were, first phase, I'll call it the savage phase. Then the second phase, barbarism. And the third phase, civilization. Now you can already see that this is what we would call a teleological model. Teleological or teleology, sorry, pronunciation's a little bad at this time in the morning. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, meaning the end or the final point. So teleology, also from Greek logos, like the ology, the study of, as in biology, geology, and so forth. Teleology is the study of the end of things, and to be teleological means that you believe that things are moving towards a final destination. And in that sense, therefore, evolution of culture is considered to be teleological, in that civilization is the goal or the end point. Now, anthropology disposed of this idea a long time ago. 100 years ago, we got rid of it. But in the popular consciousness, it's still around. Now, savage, barbarian, civilized cultures are associated with different kinship systems and different belief systems. The savage is associated with magic, the barbaric with religion, and the civilized with science. Now you can see where this is leading. It's saying that people who believe in magic or people who believe in religion are not as sophisticated or not as advanced as civilized people. And for civilized, you can read us. We are civilized. We are better than barbaric people. We are better than savage people. We believe in science. Now, you hear this a lot among celebrity scientists. I've already mentioned Richard Dawkins. Let me also talk about Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson commonly goes on TV shows, radio shows, and argues that science is better than religion because science is based on evidence. He actually uses the word evidence, and he's constantly being on that point, that evidence is the hallmark of science and the difference between science and religion. Well, that's easy to debunk. Religion is based on evidence. Magic is based on evidence. It's all experiential. It's a question of what you want to believe. For example, there are many, many, many people who believe that prayer works because they have prayed to God for something and that thing happened. Now, it's not the same as empirical science, obviously. When people pray, they're not doing controlled experiments, but they are using their experience as evidence. And the same with superstitions. I have a kind of a silly superstition that I inherited from my English mother, that on the first of the month, when I wake up and open my eyes, before I say anything else, I have to say rabbits, 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 and that way the rest of the month will be okay. Now, I don't really believe that any more than I believe that opening an umbrella indoors is going to bring me bad luck, or breaking a mirror is going to bring me 7 years of bad luck. I don't really believe any of those things, but sometimes there's a little frisson in my spirit. Somebody opens an umbrella indoors. They do it in China all the time. When I used to teach at a Chinese university and it was raining, the students would all come with umbrellas and they'd all open them up inside to dry. And I would go to class and think, oh, this is not good. I will never, never, never put shoes on a table. Never, under any circumstances. I'm sure nothing's bad going to happen, but there's something in my soul that just says, don't do that. So what I'm pointing out is that evidence exists in all of these domains. And people believe one as opposed to another, or they choose magic or religion or science for particular circumstances because of evidence. So what I want to say, therefore, is that evidence by itself is not the criterion for distinguishing between religion and science. I'm going to lump magic and religion together for a little while as the two realms that are supernatural, and science as the realm that is natural. So let's just unpack that a little bit. Magic believes that there is a supernatural realm and a natural realm, and that they are interacting with one another all the time. And so does religion, whereas science believes that there is no supernatural realm, that the natural realm is the realm where real things happen. Now, there's so many things to unpack here. Are dreams real, for example? A lot of people will say, you had a nightmare, or that was just a bad dream. It's not real. Well, it's a real experience. I used to dream that I could fly, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a real experience. Now, you can say, were you really flying? And that becomes a complex philosophical question. And I can say, well, my body was in bed asleep, but my mind had the experience of flying. I have had the experience of falling off a building or off a tall cliff and woken up in a sweat. They were real experiences in my mind. And there is where we have to make ourselves really clear. Where does reality occur? Okay, we can also get really deeply philosophical about this too, but I'm going to argue that it happens in your mind. So let's return to evidence and science versus evidence and religion, or evidence and magic. And what I'll say is that they all rely on evidence, but it's just different kinds of evidence. And so then the question becomes, what kind of evidence do you like? And there we start butting up against the concept of faith. And what I'm going to say absolutely definitively is that magic and religion and science are all based in faith. It's just a different kind of faith. And you're going to say, no, wait a minute. Science is real. Science is solid. Science is based on controlled experiments. Well, let me just move into the realm of mathematics for a minute. Start with geometry, and then I'll look at arithmetic a little. So let me delve into a little bit of the philosophy of mathematics. Promise I won't get too complicated. I know a lot of people get really scared when they have to deal with mathematics. Okay, I'm not going to do anything terribly scary, I promise. Let's start with Euclid. Euclid was an ancient Greek mathematician who is considered the founder of what we quite obviously call Euclidean geometry, or Euclidean plane geometry. And geometry, like so many other fields in mathematics, seems like it's really, really solid. And so in geometry you probably learned the Pythagorean theorem, so that you know that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to sum of the squares on the other two sides, and so on and so forth. And if you did any geometry of any sophistication, you learned how to prove theorems, and on and on and on. It all looks really, really solid, like everything is based on solid foundations. And I'm sorry to tell you that its foundations are principles of faith. Every mathematical system rests on axioms, or sometimes called postulates. And these are things that cannot be proven within the system. And Kurt Gödel, unfortunately for people who want to believe that everything is based solidly on fact, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem proves definitively that there is no mathematical system, or no logical system in general, that has any value at all, that is one that is complex enough to explain things like Euclidean geometry. There's no system that is complete, that is, that it can prove everything within itself. Or sometimes we would call it tautological, in the sense that everything rests on everything else. It's all part of one system where proof is internal. Euclidean geometry, like all mathematical systems, has to have some axioms that cannot be proven. They have to be accepted, wait for it, on faith. All right, well, there are 5 axioms in Euclidean geometry, and the first 4 are pretty sound. There's no real problem with them. I won't go into them. I'm going to keep my mathematics very simple. I'm just going to talk about the 5th axiom. It's called the parallel postulate, and it has a formal way of expressing it. I'm just going to use an informal way because we don't need to get
that formal. The simple statement of the parallel postulate is that parallel lines never meet. Okay? So you draw parallel lines. Doesn't matter how long you draw them to infinity, and even in infinity, they don't meet. Well, that sounds okay. I mean, because our experience, back to evidence, if you start drawing parallel lines, they don't meet. So you can imagine if you draw them for 10 miles or 100 miles or 1,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles, they don't meet. And Euclidean geometry rests on that postulate and the other four. All right, well, as I said, the other four are okay. Nobody's got any real problems with them, but they do have problems with the parallel postulate. And some geometers argued, well, what if they do meet in infinity? If you draw them for an infinite distance, then they meet. And other geometers said, well, okay. What happens if they move apart in infinity? Now, one of the ways to test such a hypothesis is to do what's called the reductio, or reductio ad absurdum. You try the opposite of what you're trying to prove, and if the opposite leads to a logically absurd consequence, then you have validated the opposite. So they said, okay, well, let us just hypothesize that parallel lines meet at infinity. Does the geometry that we produce from that new postulate produce absurd or that's illogical consequences in geometry? And the fact is, it doesn't. It just produces a different geometry. Same with having parallel lines move apart in infinity. It produces a different geometry. It doesn't produce an illogical one. So therefore, the fifth axiom, the parallel postulate, is not necessary. It's a principle of faith alone. So if you change your principle of faith, you change your geometry. That's all. Now I would like to switch a little bit to arithmetic, but I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to ask you to be patient and wait a week for more of what I'm talking about here, because we're getting a little close to the 30-minute mark, and I want to try to keep things to about half an hour. All right, so let's look at arithmetic. Now you think maybe that arithmetic is really, really solid, and particularly you think that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and there's no way that anyone can say that this is dependent on faith. And I'm sorry to disabuse you, but it is also. I used to ask my students to prove to me that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And they would always do something of this kind of nature. They'd hold up 2 fingers and 2 fingers, and they'd put them together and they'd say, okay, 4 fingers. And I would, of course, be infuriating and say, yes, that's just an empirical proof that 2 fingers and 2 fingers make 4 fingers. What about 2 oranges and 2 oranges, or 2 giraffes and 2 giraffes, and on and on. And of course, I was just being infuriating, but I was showing them that all they were doing was offering me an empirical demonstration. They were not offering me a mathematical proof. And the fact is that a mathematical proof for addition in arithmetic is extraordinarily difficult. And it also relies on axioms or on postulates. And there were several mathematicians, Peano, Dedekind, for example, who went about the process of finding the axioms of arithmetic, and they came up with sometimes 8, sometimes 9, sometimes 10, depends who you talk to and what what their particular philosophies are. But I'm here to tell you that arithmetic, just like Euclidean geometry, rests on postulates. I'll just give you the first one as a teaser. I'm not going to get very complicated with this, and I'm going to move into other subjects in my next video. The first Peano postulate is that 0 is a natural number. Okay, well, there's a statement of faith, and it's not a particularly good one. 0 is a number. What does it represent? What empirically can you show me that 0 represents? Okay, there's a lot to think about. I'm going to leave you with these thoughts for the next week, and I will come back to these next Friday. Bye.